The colonization of the Americas was an event that marked a turning point in the social configuration of the continent. It was a long and complex process that involved many elements, such as trade, exploration, conquest, settlements, and of course, wars and massacres. Estimates of indigenous deaths during this period generally place the number at around 50 million, which would account for 90% of the native population and 10% of the global population at the time. The sheer scale of the deaths was so massive that it led to a global temperature drop. This, Great Dying, would be the deadliest event in history relative to the world's population, followed by World War II, which, despite having 80 million victims, accounted for only 3% of the global population at the time. Despite the fact that colonization had some positive effects, such as the Columbian Exchange, it was also a massive catastrophe for native populations. Yet, a considerable number of weirdos on the internet, mainly tradcaths and Spanish Empire fetishists, many of whom sympathize with fascist ideologies, deny these facts, arguing that colonization was incredible. They tend to downplay its harmful effects while exaggerating the positive ones. Among this group, we find PaxTube, a Catholic LARPer who proclaims himself a social critic and voice of reason on YouTube. I have already discussed this guy in a previous debunking. For those unfamiliar with him, he is a tradcath who makes videos promoting reactionary and far-right propaganda. He buys into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and sympathizes with fascists, all while waving the banner of tradition and Catholicism, under which many fascists hide and justify their hatred. As a good LARPer and traditionalist, PaxTube justifies colonization. One of his videos is titled, "What They Didn't Teach You About Colonization." Like most of his content, it is just more PragerU-style propaganda, filled with questionable and completely biased sources, designed not to teach history but to make his followers feel good about being trads. Since I want to remain respectful of historical scholarship, and because it's always useful to debunk the lies of the tardcaths, today we will be refuting this video, once again exposing the ignorance of PaxTube and his moronic followers. All sources are in the description.
In the late 1400s, European adventurers set out at sea and began what is today called the Age of Discovery. Explorers like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan changed history forever and charted courses around the world. The discovery of North and South America led to colonization. This is defined as the movement of people from one land to another in order to settle it or control it. Colonization of the Americas began a new chapter of world history, one where Europe would be at the forefront. Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Italian, and more. Many European ethnicities all played a role in exploring the New World. Colonization and its surrounding events continue to have massive effects on geopolitics today. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, is a product of colonization. If you live in the Western Hemisphere, the odds are you wouldn't be here without colonizers. Today, views of colonization vary depending on who you ask. Some paint it as a simple evil, and put huge emphasis on things like slavery and the wrongs done to native populations. This point of view has become especially common among young people. Polls in recent years show that 79% of Americans under the age of 30 say that white people are oppressors. The way we understand the history of colonization affects not only our view of the past, but our view of the present. Of course, this extremely narrow anti-colonial viewpoint leaves out massive context and critical facts. Colonization is an important issue that deserves to be treated with more seriousness than it is. As students of history, we must seek the historical truth through knowledge, understand the context of historical events, and recognize that people in the past were just like us who lived in different circumstances. In this video, I'll be explaining key facts about colonization that you weren't taught. This video will focus mainly on colonization of the New World. I'll begin with the background of colonization, explain how European colonization worked, address the controversies surrounding colonization, and then end by going over the positives of colonization. Be sure to watch to the end because you aren't going to want to miss those. Colonization of some form or another has gone on since the ancient world. When a society becomes healthy and thriving, it often looks to expand to new lands and shores. Expanding outward is one of the primary signs that a civilization is working. The ancient Greeks, for example, were famous colonizers. They spread themselves all across the Mediterranean. Greek culture and trade flourished across multiple continents for centuries. The Phoenicians, a people native to the Middle East, were another ancient group who were successful colonizers. Carthage, a city you may have heard of, was their most successful colony. It would go on to challenge Rome for control of the Mediterranean world. The point I'm making here is that colonization was by no means something that started in the 1500s by Europeans, even if Europeans would go on to be the most successful colonizers in history.
This is a classic tactic used by reactionary groups whenever someone criticizes the European colonization of the Americas, arguing that Europeans didn't invent colonization because it already existed. The Nazis didn't invent genocide either, but I'm pretty sure they were its greatest exponents. Additionally, colonization is not always synonymous with a healthy and strong society. It depends on the context. I also don't believe that a civilization expanding is universally positive, especially when it does so at the expense of others' lives.
The Age of Discovery started at the end of the 15th century. It was driven by many different factors. Contrary to what some think, Europe was already a prospering civilization long before colonization. The 1400s are known as the Late Middle Ages. Europe had recovered from the Black Plague and was excelling in commerce, religion, art, and urban development. Research indicates that by the 1400s, parts of Europe like northern Italy were the most developed in the entire world. You can see on this map how in the year 1500, before any major colonies were established, Western Europe already had a serious portion of the world's wealth. Economic historians like Professor Stephen Broadberry have shown that Western Europe had already achieved a higher standard of living than places like Asia by the late 1300s.
Not really. Saying that Europe was a place where only prosperity existed is a dangerous oversimplification of history, as it promotes Eurocentric ideas and doesn't fit with actual historical evidence. The 1400s, while they had moments of prosperity, also saw periods of stagnation and decline for European economies. As you can see in this graph, economies experienced fluctuations of growth and decline. If we look closely, we can see how economies like Italy's went through these ups and downs, so that by the 1500s they had returned to 1400s levels. Others, like Spain and Portugal, remained nearly stagnant. But we won't stop there. In this graph, we see the European business cycle and how contractions were almost as frequent as expansions until the 1800s, with nearly the same magnitude. In fact, if you take a closer look at the graph that PaxTube provides, India and China had a greater share of global GDP. The only area where they were surpassed was in GDP per capita, but this has an explanation. India and China had significantly larger populations during these periods. Regarding his claim about living standards, I checked the source he provided. While what he says is technically true, the data is misleading. Further down, we can confirm that China had a larger share of global GDP, and if we read carefully, we can verify what I mentioned about population. If attention is restricted to large Asian states such as China and Japan, then it would appear that the Great Divergence had already occurred by 1400, when the leading Asian state was already substantially poorer than the three leading European countries. However, China was dramatically larger than any individual European country. Chinese population in 1600 was 160 million, compared with 13.1 million in Italy, 4.2 million in Britain, and just 1.5 million in the Netherlands. While the GDP per capita gap between the leading European nations and China remained small, as it did until the 18th century, smaller Chinese regions such as the Yangtze Delta, which were of comparable size to European countries, may still have been on a par with the richest parts of Europe.
Islamic piracy that had devastated Mediterranean commerce for centuries had been driven back. European navies had gained naval supremacy and could protect their coasts better than ever before.
Actually, by the 1400s, piracy in the Mediterranean was still a serious problem for European trade. In fact, even Europeans themselves through orders like the Knights Hospitaller of Malta, funded their own pirate groups. For centuries, different corsair groups from both sides clashed. This war over Mediterranean piracy would not end until the 1800s, when the expeditions to Tripoli and North Africa by the United States and European states finally put an end to pirate campaigns.
The Reformation had also not yet occurred, and most of the European continent had religious unity through the Catholic Church.
This is also a lie. For instance, we have the Hussite Wars between 1419 and 1436, in which the Hussites were able to repel all Catholic attacks, only being defeated due to the betrayal of the Utraquists. The Lollards remained an active group in England, even getting involved in armed revolts. Girolamo Savonarola and the Piagnoni were highly critical of the Catholic Church. Oh, and let's not forget the Western Schism. You know, that time when there were 3 popes at the same time, and European states took sides against each other.
Historian Alfred W. Crosby noted that in Columbus's day, Europe had the highest degree of mechanical and technological knowledge in the world.
I'm not sure about to show this, but I'll do it anyways. Citing a review from Randall C. Brooks respect Crosby's work. There is a fundamental flaw in his theory. Contrary to Crosby's hypothesis, previous societies were concerned with measurement and its application in various ways. The fact that we still use 360 degrees, 60-minute hours, the Pythagorean theorem, or still have institutions like Tholos, the Julian calendar or the number 0 reflects our reliance on the innovative minds of civilizations who have discovered, applied and subsequently influenced those who followed. Each of the above concepts reflects a civilization's interest in measurement in science, technology or business. Later says, Crosby argues in the preface that Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and Juana Capac were great conquerors, but they were all confined to no more than one continent and at best a wedge of a second. They were homebodies compared with Queen Victoria, on whose empire the sun literally never set. Well, Alexander traveled and conquered in 3 continents, Genghis Khan in 2, while Queen Victoria never left Britain. The scale of the British Empire reflects the skills of successive generations of shipbuilders, astronomers and navigators building on measured and empirical knowledge passed from Greeks, to Romans, to Arabs, and so on. The temporal influence on world affairs of the British stretched from 1588 to, being generous, the Second World War. Truly a mere wedge of a second, compared to the 2 or 3 millennia of the Egyptian or Chinese civilizations.
A classic sign of a healthy civilization is whether it's expanding outwards or collapsing inwards. Colonization at this time should be seen as a healthy, powerful Europe reaching out to new parts of the world. Compare this to, say, modern Europe, where the countries are in decline and their birth rates have collapsed. In fact, one could easily make the argument that modern Europe is being colonized by mass immigration.
The point PaxTube is trying to make here is that colonization is a sign of a society's strength, in this case, European society. The problem is that he argues this from a perspective that only can be applied to Europe. First, ignoring the fact that Europe was not as powerful as PaxTube wants to portray, the idea that colonization proves the continent's strength and dominance is not universally positive. That perspective is only beneficial to the colonizing state, in this case, Europe. Or would you really want to be a Taino during Columbus's voyages? Second, notice how he speaks of European colonization in a positive tone, but when the topic shifts to issues like the refugee crisis affecting Africa and the Middle East, he frames it as an invasion, because most people like PaxTube believe refugees are invaders. This reveals that PaxTube thinks the only good colonization is European, all others must be stopped at all costs, even if it doesn't count as colonization. These kinds of rhetorical maneuvers are typical among reactionary ideologues.
To put it simply, Europe in the late 1400s was a growing and vibrant place bustling with life. Missions of colonization to the New World would put this vigor on full display. Any suggestion that colonization was done by desperate, poor Europeans is absurd. Europe at the time of colonization already had wealth. But there would be one pivotal event that kicked off the Age of Exploration: the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the fall of Constantinople. By 1453, the Ottoman Empire had taken over huge parts of Eastern Europe. This was in spite of several Christian coalitions that tried to stop it. Due to the hostility between Christians and Muslims, the Ottomans used their newfound strength to cut off European trade routes to Asia. The Ottomans controlled the ancient Silk Road, which was the main route of trade between Europe and Asia. Europe losing access to this commerce had the potential to be economically devastating. Thus, European societies had to innovate to find new paths to Asia around the Ottomans. Exploring sea routes was the best option. Scientists of the time period already figured out that the world was round, so it was only a matter of finding the safest and quickest way to Asia. To do this, Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal perfected the caravel ship model. This was a new model of ship that was perfect for long-distance sea travel. It was small, maneuverable, and fast, good on both oceans and rivers. Its development and the work of Henry to sponsor exploration missions are credited with starting the Age of Discovery. As it turned out, the New World ended up being much larger than anyone had anticipated. The European kingdoms like Spain and Portugal realized its potential to strengthen their empires. Conquering the native tribes and subjugating them to the crown was seen as common sense, especially given the European technological superiority. This was the Age of Empires. Groups trying to conquer each other was just how it was. Let's remember that the two biggest states in the Americas before colonization were the Aztec and Incan empires. Emphasis on empires. Do people think they got their land through sunshine and friendship? The discovery of the New World also created an unprecedented situation for the Catholic Church. The discovery of vast new lands and peoples meant that there were untold millions who had never been reached with the true faith. Jesus himself had said, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." For this reason, the Church has always had a missionary mandate. Many people went to the New World with genuine Catholic zeal to spread the faith to new shores.
For anyone well versed in history, it is clear that evangelization was merely an excuse to colonize these lands. I won't deny that some groups, like the Jesuits, genuinely sought the conversion of native peoples, but assuming that the discourse of evangelization had no ulterior motives is a very naive stance. This is known as the doctrine of discovery, in which the Catholic Church issued a series of papal bulls that justified colonization. One of the most notable was Inter Caetera, promulgated by Alexander VI, which states that in our times especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. The doctrine of discovery became the foundation of European powers' territorial claims in the Americas and the basis for the westward expansion of the United States. In the unanimous ruling of the 1823 case Johnson v. McIntosh, Chief Justice John Marshall affirmed that the principle of discovery granted European nations absolute rights over lands in the New World. Moreover, this doctrine extended to other parts of the world, such as New Zealand, where in 1877, the case of Parata v. Bishop of Wellington effectively nullified Maori land rights, a ruling that wasn't overturned until 2003. And by the way, this doctrine is now criticized by the Catholic Church itself, just to mention.
Now, it's important to define and describe exactly how European colonization worked. It took two main forms. The first form was to administer and economically benefit from areas populated by non-Europeans. Generally, these new areas were conquered and the people living there were brought under the rule of a European dynasty. The Spanish conquest of Mexico is one such example of this. I'll talk more about that later. This type of colonization was also sometimes done in self-defense. For example, North Africa was colonized by Europeans mainly as a response to the non-stop piracy that was coming out of the region. France and Spain conquering Algeria and Morocco finally ended the reign of terror of the infamous Barbary pirates. If you don't want to get colonized, don't do piracy.
This is one of the stupidest points he has made, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, colonization, by definition, is never defensive. Why? Because colonization is defined as the control and domination of a territory by a metropolis, usually through coercion. Colonization is a manifestation of imperialism, which has been characteristic of European powers. Colonialism is inherently imperialistic, and imperialism, by its very nature, is not defensive. Under this same premise, Israel's colonialist actions in the West Bank could also be justified. Secondly, the colonization of North Africa was driven by expansionist interests rather than self-defense as PaxTube claims. For example, French Algeria underwent a settler colonial process led by European French settlers, often through violent means, one of the main causes of the Algerian War of Independence. This pattern of colonialism and settlement also manifested in other areas of North Africa. To put things into perspective, By the early 1950s, settlers controlled 4.5 million hectares of cultivable land in North Africa. As a result, settlers held 23% of arable land, a figure that jumps to 40% if we exclude marginally cultivable areas. Furthermore, the colonization of Algeria ultimately killed 10% of its population and involved promoting Arab-Amazigh rivalries. This is known as the Algerian Genocide. Moving beyond France, other countries were no less guilty. Italy carried out a brutal pacification of Libya, which resulted in another genocide. Spain fought multiple wars in Morocco, and so on. In case after case, colonization was driven by imperialist ambitions, not self-defense, as PaxTube wants his followers to believe. All of this took place within the broader context of the scramble for Africa. Thirdly, piracy had already ended long before the colonialist actions of European powers. With the Barbary Wars, piracy had significantly declined. Fourth and finally, if you don't want migrants, don't plunder their countries.
But this type of conquest was just one form of colonization. The second main form was the process of bringing settlers from the Old World to the New World, creating essentially European outposts. It needs to be understood that not all of the lands colonized in the New World were already inhabited. Huge amounts of land was simply empty. North and South America are massive continents, and it wasn't really until the late 1900s that they truly started to fill out with people.
Once again, this is another lie. The idea that the Americas were a vast unpopulated territory is known as the myth of the pristine land. However, there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the Americas had significant human populations across various landscapes. To begin with, let's examine the numbers of the native population. While statistics vary due to the lack of concrete information, experts estimate that there were between 40 to 80 million people across the continent, if not more. If the higher estimates are accurate, the Americas may have been more densely populated than Europe. Moving from population to vegetation, native actions significantly altered the landscape. In the United States, for example, the forests of New England and the Midwest were cleared to create new landscapes. As Michael Williams states in his History of American Forests, much of the natural forest remained, but the forest was not the vast, silent, unbroken, impenetrable and dense tangle of trees beloved by many writers in their romantic accounts of the forest wilderness. This pattern of forest alteration by native peoples was also present in tropical areas such as Central America. Regarding South America, there is the case of its savannas, which, although largely natural, were also subject to controlled burns by native populations for their own use. Concerning agricultural fields, while they were often temporary, historical accounts describe their immense scale. For example, in Hispaniola, Bartolomé de las Casas wrote about individual fields with thousands of montones, mounds of cassava and sweet potato, each 3 to 4 meters in circumference. In the plains of Moxos, explorers reported the presence of perchels, maize granaries numbering up to 700 in a single field. In Florida, Hernando de Soto's army marched through vast cultivated lands. Beyond European records, there is archaeological evidence. Agricultural structures include terraces, dikes, canals, reservoirs, diversion walls, and many other constructions, totaling millions across the continent. For example, in the Andes of Peru, there are 600,000 hectares of prehistoric terraces. In the San Jorge River Basin in Colombia, 500,000 hectares of abandoned raised fields have been found. In the Lake Titicaca region, 19,000 hectares of these same fields remain. Even more astonishingly, these remnants represent less than 25% of what once existed. Thus, we continue to find traces of human activity throughout the continent. As geographer William Denevan stated, the pristine image of 1492 seems to be a myth, then, an image more applicable to 1750, following Indian decline.
As a side note, this is why Israel is not comparable to European colonization. Israel does not seek to make a colony out of the Middle East or economically benefit from ruling over Palestinians. The Israel-Palestine conflict is essentially a race war between two ethnic groups who both claim they're indigenous to the same land. Zionist policies effectively seek to eliminate the Palestinians, which is nothing like what most European colonization was about.
3 things I want to note. 1. This is yet another ridiculously stupid point. Israel is indeed colonizing Palestine. and is economically benefiting from the process. 2. I don't think I'm the only one who feels that PaxTube is bringing this topic up out of nowhere. He was literally talking about Europe just moments ago, and suddenly, he shifts to Israel and Palestine. 3. I don't know if it's just me, but I have a feeling that PaxTube took this opportunity solely to throw shit at Jews. Let's remember that PaxTube, as a good tard cat, holds anti-Semitic views, and as such, latched onto a complex issue like colonization just to bash the Jewish state. Maybe it's just me, but I get the sense that was his intention.
Let's look at one classic example of colonization of the New World, the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. It was led by Hernán Cortés, the famous conquistador. Upon reaching Mexico, he told his men, "Brothers and companions, let us follow the sign of the cross with the true faith, and in it we shall conquer." He then ordered the destruction of their ships so that failure was not an option. The Spanish had 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and most importantly, firearms that the natives had never seen before. With this, they conquered the Aztec Empire after a 2-year war. Sometimes the Spanish are portrayed as barbaric, but let's look at what the natives were doing before they got there. The native Mexica practiced more human sacrifice than any other New World population. Every imperial city and large town had a central square with a temple pyramid where human sacrifices were performed. The victim was laid on a table, and a priest would cut out his or her beating heart and hold it for worshippers to see. Aztec imperial law mandated 1,000 human sacrifices every year in every temple, which totaled nearly 20,000 victims annually. They did this because they believed the world came into being through the sacrifice of the gods, and they could only be sustained by the sacrifice of human blood. I point this out not only to show the reality of history, but also to give a sense of gravity to what losing to the Aztecs meant. Of course, the Aztecs weren't alone in practices like this. Tribes like the Goitaca were cannibalistic. Sources note how they not only ate humans for ritualistic purposes, but they enjoyed the taste of human flesh and ate it for pleasure. European colonization brought an end to all of these practices.
This last thing we've seen is a very common and repeated argument in reactionary circles when discussing colonization, pointing to the atrocities and practices of native peoples whenever the crimes of the colonizers are brought up. Just a little common sense is enough to realize that this is a fallacy, a tactic to divert attention from your own crimes by pointing at your neighbor's crimes. This strategy, the infamous whataboutism, is a tool often used by people like PaxTube. According to the logic of this fallacy, you can't blame Europeans for their crimes because native peoples also committed crimes. However, and this is something based on simple common sense, the sacrifices performed by the Aztecs do not justify the atrocities committed by the conquistadors. This kind of logic is frequently used when discussing atrocities committed by European states. Reactionaries celebrate the fall of native cultures under the justification of putting an end to sacrifices. Now, moving on to historical facts, I'll begin by addressing the issue of sacrifices. To begin with, we really don't know how many people were sacrificed by the Aztecs. Most sources from the time come from the conquistadors themselves, who tended to exaggerate the numbers in order to justify the conquest by portraying the Aztecs as savagely as possible. For example, the rumor that the dedication of the Mayor Temple involved 80,000 sacrifices, which would mean approximately 14 sacrifices per minute, which is physically impossible. Then we have the figure of 20,000. While I admit it is plausible, there are studies suggesting numbers as low as a few hundred. Additionally, the amount varied depending on the size of the temple, with some performing only a handful of sacrifices or very few at all. However, going back to the main point, we cannot be certain about the number of victims in Aztec sacrifices, but we can theorize that the figures were likely inflated by the Spanish, and even by the Aztecs themselves as a way to intimidate other peoples, but in the end we don't know the number. Regarding the claim that this was required by law, I looked into the topic and didn't find anything to confirm or refute this idea. If what was meant is that it was a ritual law, then I'll concede that point, but if not, then it's likely a lie until we discover new evidence. Also, we could also apply whataboutism, given that ancient European civilizations also practiced mass human sacrifices. However, I won't do that out of respect for logic and the coherence of my argument. I will, however, point out how people like PaxTube apply that excuse only for Europeans, but not for other nations. Now, let's talk about cannibalism. The topic of cannibalism is one of reactionaries' favorites when discussing the conquest, as it provides the perfect justification to argue that the conquistadors were the good guys. After all, who wouldn't fight to put an end to cannibalism? However, the reality is much more complex than these groups want to make it seem. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, he wrote extensively about the indigenous peoples, portraying them in the most negative light as possible, depicting them as merciless savages. This tendency to describe natives as the worst scum of humanity was quite common during the conquest. In many cases, it was done deliberately, as it served as a justification for the conquest and enslavement of native peoples. This image of the cannibal native remained unquestioned for much of history. However, in recent years, efforts have been made to assess the truth behind these claims. Scholars have discovered that these accounts were likely exaggerated, finding only modest evidence of native cannibalism. Some even argue that groups like the Taino or the Arawak lied about it to encourage the conquistadors to wipe out their enemies. There are many details I could go into, such as the fact that these were generally ritual sacrifices in which women and children were excluded. But suffice it to say that these reports tended to be exaggerated and were often rumors or repeated claims spread by colonialists. Now, this is not to say that sacrifices or cannibalism didn't happen. They certainly did, although not in the scale reactionaries tend to believe. My point here is to highlight how reactionaries tend to talk about native peoples, painting a black legend in which they were nothing more than simple, violent savages who never accomplished anything, while the conquistadors were noble and kind, driven by Christian ideals, even though that is a complete lie.
Now, the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs was significantly aided by technological superiority. Having guns and horses while your opponent does not is obviously a major advantage. However, the conquest was significantly aided by other native tribes who hated the Aztecs. Over 200,000 natives joined the Spanish in a coalition to bring down the Aztecs. This coalition would be what defeated the Aztec Empire once and for all. This is how colonizers like the Spanish operated, not simply smashing people with brute force, but also using diplomacy and wit. The Spanish would go on to build the biggest colonial empire in the Americas. Colonization is a topic that has several contentious issues surrounding it. These things shouldn't be ignored, but addressed directly. First, let's look at the issue of slavery. A common narrative that's circulated today is what I like to call the uniquely evil whites slavery narrative. It essentially states that Europeans are uniquely evil for slavery and thus should be punished in the modern world for their supposed crimes. In the following section, I will dismantle that narrative. Let's start with some basic, undisputed facts. Slavery is something that's been practiced through all of human history, in all lands, at all times, in one form or another. The ancient Greeks had slavery. The ancient Chinese had slavery. The Islamic world had slavery. Ancient Israel and the Jews had slavery. Africans engaged in slavery. The man you see on the screen was named Tipu Tip. He was a Zanzibar merchant who owned over 10,000 slaves. Odd how people like him aren't talked about more. In fact, slavery still exists in many parts of the world today. The point here is that slavery did not magically appear in the 1500s.
This is another common point in reactionary discourse regarding colonization. You can't blame Europeans for practicing slavery because everyone was doing it. The problem is that this is yet another case of whataboutism, which I have already said is a fallacy. Or would it be logical for a murderer to say, "But Your Honor, did I invent murder?" The fact that someone did not invent the crime they commit does not make them any less guilty of it, especially if they know it is wrong. The Nazis did not invent genocide, but that doesn't absolve them of the crime. Moreover, if we use the same logic, we cannot blame natives for sacrifices and cannibalism, right? Obviously, PaxTube does not make this connection. The point here is, it does not matter if everyone else practiced slavery, that does not change the fact that Europeans did as well. Even more so, they were the creators of the transatlantic slave trade, which involved the capture and transport of 12 million people, 2 million of whom died along the way. This was the largest forced long-distance movement of people recorded in history, something uniquely European. And just in case, when I searched what was the cruelest form of slavery, all the results talked about the United States and the transatlantic trade.
European Christendom had actually abolished slavery of other Christians during the Middle Ages.
I don't know if it's just me, but I think it would have been better if they had abolished slavery in all its forms. And some of them, like the United Kingdom, Spain, or post-revolutionary France, were among the last to abolish it completely.
The tendency to blame slavery on the so-called white man is an outrageous rewriting of history. Giving proper context to slavery shows that, outside of the racial aspect, its practice in the New World wasn't really special. Slavery in the New World was also not something that only European Christians participated in. Jews, Native Americans, and free blacks were enthusiastic participants. Even Jewish sources like the Israeli-run newspaper Haaretz note that Southern Jews owned slaves in comparable numbers to their white, non-Jewish neighbors.
I took the time to read the article and found some interesting details. Such facts have been used, and widely exaggerated, by anti-Semites, but are among the uncomfortable truths of Southern Jewish history. Key word: exaggerated. Further down, the article states, Jews in the South suffered from more than arbitrary arrests during their centuries-long history, their lives were also threatened. In this context, MSJE displays an advertisement published in 1894 in which Jews were warned to leave Montgomery, Alabama, and told that if they did not, they would pay the consequences. The threat was directed at the city's Levine and Sons and Rosenberg Brothers business enterprises, among others, and came from various local extremists, among them the Ku Klux Klan, who saw Jews as another target of the violent struggle they waged first and foremost against blacks. After reading the entire article, I realized it was a sensationalist headline. The article actually discusses the general life of Jews in the South, their participation in daily activities, and some important figures in U.S. history, such as Rabbi Israel Dresner, who, according to the article, was America's most arrested rabbi. The point here is not to absolve Jews of their participation in the crime of slavery but to show how PaxTube selectively takes parts of a source to fuel hatred against different groups, in this case, Jews. All of this is done to push a narrative based solely on baseless theories. From a more historical perspective, after researching the topic, I found that Jewish involvement in black slavery did not significantly impact the South. Quoting an article, given their small numbers, Jewish slave owning or trading was not consequential in the broader slave economy. Southern history would have been the same if Jews had not settled here. One Richmond firm alone is estimated to have sold 10,000 slaves, far exceeding the total Jewish involvement in the trade. Yet, that Jews willingly owned, sold, and bought slaves reveals them to be unexceptional Americans. Again, the point here is not to absolve Jews who participated in the crime of slavery but to show how PaxTube takes a fact and exaggerates or manipulates it to push their narrative.
But hold on, I'm not even close to done. The slave trade in the Americas would never have been possible without the slave trade that already existed in Africa. African kingdoms sold their slaves to colonial companies who then transported them to the New World. This is all worth pointing out not to moralize about slavery, but to show that it was a multi-layered issue. The point here is not to villainize anyone. It's to point out how the way that some people today talk endlessly about slavery and treat it as a white-only endeavor is deeply deceptive. They know the true reality, that all groups were involved, but they suppress this in order to advance their own political agenda. During colonization, slavery also wasn't universally practiced. There were, from the beginning, many different rulers and religious leaders who forbade it. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, forbade his subjects from enslaving or robbing native peoples in mission lands. In 1537, Pope Paul III issued a document known as Sublimis Deus, where he announced that abuse of Native Americans would carry the penalty of excommunication. We therefore are vigilant that these Indians, even if outside the bosom of the Church, are not deprived, nor are they to be deprived, of their freedom or the ownership of their goods, for they are men, and therefore capable of faith and salvation, and thus they are not to be destroyed by enslavement, but rather invited to life through preaching and example. This papal edict was followed by Charles V's new laws in 1542, which freed all indigenous slaves in Spanish America.
PaxTard now talks about how Europeans issued laws for the protection of the Indians. However, these had as much application as anti-corruption laws. That is, as PaxTard will later admit, they weren't always applied in practice. Let's start with Charles V and something PaxTard didn't mention, the encomiendas. The encomiendas were the labor system that the Spanish implemented during the conquest. This was based on the distribution of indigenous people, where natives were distributed among encomenderos, who were tasked with giving them work, caring for them, and evangelizing them. In practice, it was slavery in everything but name. There are many records of the abuses committed under this system, where, in addition to working under exploitative conditions, natives had to pay tribute to their boss. It was precisely these abuses that led the Spanish crown to take action. But like any law, it was not widely enforced, and abuses against indigenous people continued. To make matters worse, the importation of African slaves began to replace this labor force. I also need to add a fact that many of these Spain fetishists don't know, the Encomenderos Rebellion. In summary, when the Spanish crown enacted these laws that, at least on paper, protected the Indians, many encomenderos rebelled because these laws undermined their power. Basically, the Spanish version of the Confederates. This was one of many internal conflicts during the conquest, showing that the conquistadors were also a divided group. To summarize this point, it doesn't matter how many laws a government enacts, if they are not applied, they lose merit. And moreover, if we follow this logic, we cannot blame the United Kingdom for what they did in India, since in 1858 Queen Victoria issued a proclamation that nominally guaranteed rights to Hindus. And if we want to be even more nitpicky, one could argue that it was the British East India Company, not the UK itself, that was responsible for the atrocities. But using this kind of logic makes no sense, right? The fact is that no matter if a government passes a law, if it is not applied, it is little more than wasted paper. Now I want to jump to another related point, the fact that the Spanish did legally enslave indigenous people through what is known as just war. Just war is a political concept that dictates that a war is legitimate if it is waged for a just cause. I don't think one needs to be a genius to understand that this concept is nonsense. The only kind of war that everyone would consider just is a defensive war. Beyond that, there is no justification for armed conflict. With this in mind, during the conquest, Europeans used this concept to justify their domination over indigenous peoples. This just war theory was used to subjugate native peoples and force their eventual conversion, especially those who resisted. Regarding sublimis deus, we find more of the same, decrees that were not enforced in practice. The best example of this is the reductions, which were towns where natives were forced to live and where they were introduced to civilization and Christianity, essentially the equivalent of Indian boarding schools in the United States. Quoting an article, the situation changed around 1570 when, by order of Viceroy Toledo, what became known as the new extirpation emerged. This led to the institutionalization of the roles of doctrinal priests and idol exterminators, who, with the goal of saving the Indians, carried out intense searches for idols and wakas worshipped by the natives, destroying any presence of the devil on earth. This extirpation campaign went hand in hand with a profound reorganization of the reduction system, which involved large population movements that completely altered the demographic configuration of the region. Even with these measures, natives continued practicing their religion, often clandestinely. This situation resulted in the syncretism visible in Latin America today, though the intent behind these reductions remains evident. To this, we must add the fact that the bull did not prohibit African slavery, which resulted in Portugal becoming the country that transported the most slaves from Africa to the Americas, followed by Great Britain and France.
Of course, laws and edicts against enslaving natives were not always followed by colonists. In some cases, when attempts to ease slavery were made, there were even revolts by landowners to keep their slaves. Slavery has always been driven by the human condition, pursuit of money and power. The slave trade would vastly expand in the 1600s as cash crops became more lucrative, and Africans were seen as the best workers to harvest them in the tropical climate. People accepted African slavery as permissible since it was believed that it would help them adjust to advanced civilization. Early capitalism, globalization, and competition between empires made the slave trade take on new life. People felt that if they didn't make use of slavery, they'd be outcompeted by those who did. This created a vicious cycle. At the end of the day, the key point to take from all of this is this: the excesses of slavery were not unique to the New World and cannot be laid at the feet of a group like the Catholic Church or the white race as a whole. In the West, we have the best records of our slave trade, but historians have also estimated the cost of the Arab, African, and Asian slave trades that were happening at the same time. These estimates easily reach into the tens of millions, even dwarfing the transatlantic slave trade. It's estimated that half the population of many African regions such as modern-day Cameroon, Congo, and Niger were slaves. This was without any European involvement. This was the reality of the world in those times. Despite this, let's not forget that the West would also be the first to abolish slavery.
Ignoring the horrendous amount of whataboutism he threw in regarding slavery in Africa, believing that African slavery was the same as European slavery, saying that the West was the first to abolish slavery is a myth full of generalizations and oversimplifications. To begin with, the Chinese were the first recorded abolitionists, possibly making China one of the first nations to abolish slavery under Emperor Wang Mang. There's also the fact that the Achaemenid Empire had a very limited form of slavery. Another notable example is the emancipation of slaves under Gwangjong of Goryeo in Korea around 956 AD. Examples like these can be found in non-European states. The path toward abolitionism was not exclusive to Europeans, but something that developed at different paces across all societies. Europeans, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, could afford to abolish slave labor, but not all civilizations had that luxury, especially under European imperialism. Furthermore, if by the West we refer exclusively to Europe and North America, excluding Latin America, which has a majority mestizo population, the situation worsens for the so-called white people, because many of these Latin American nations abolished slavery before their European counterparts. Additionally, abolitionism was largely driven by various slave revolts. And as a final note, just to annoy monarchists, France first abolished slavery during its revolutionary period, only for it to be reinstated under a monarchy. I mention this because PaxTube despises that revolution.
Finally, we should deal with the most damning accusation against colonization: Native American genocide. The reality is that mass death did occur among the natives in the Americas. But these were from diseases that Europeans had no control over. People's understanding of disease in the colonial era was extremely limited. Neither the colonizers nor the natives properly understood how to keep themselves and others from catching diseases. Germ theory didn't exist until the mid-1800s, hundreds of years after colonization took place. To lay the death of every native on colonizers is absurd. For comparison, the Mongol Empire brought the Black Death to Europe, and yet no one blames Asians collectively as responsible for the deaths caused by that plague, nor should they.
Ignoring once again the overwhelming amount of whataboutism he just engaged in, the reality is that Europeans can indeed be blamed for the deaths of indigenous peoples from disease with a simple premise. They brought them. European settlers were the cause of these epidemics, just as one could blame the Mongols for spreading the plague. However, doing so diverts attention from the central point, something PaxTube seems unable to grasp. Now, regarding the diseases themselves, the idea that European infections wiped out most of the indigenous population is known as the virgin soil theory. This theory is a favorite among reactionaries because it absolves Europeans of responsibility for native depopulation. However, this narrative conveniently ignores how European mistreatment of indigenous peoples worsened sanitary conditions, creating a vicious cycle. Conquest exacerbated public health crises, and those crises, in turn, made conquest easier. The claim that diseases were the sole or primary cause of indigenous deaths is overly simplistic and highly contested by scholars. According to the article Virgin Soil Revisited, multiple factors contributed to mass mortality, including malnutrition and the deteriorating conditions imposed by colonization. The notion that indigenous peoples had no immunity to European pathogens is largely unfounded beyond the mere fact of lack of prior exposure. Furthermore, there were widespread epidemics among European settlers themselves, despite their supposed immunity, and many of the diseases in question were relatively new even to the colonizers. This is a highly complex issue, and upon closer examination, it is impossible to reduce everything to indigenous people had no protection, so it was inevitable. The article makes it clear that mass indigenous death was not inevitable. But why does this idea persist? Quoting directly from the article, perhaps the idea that Indian depopulation can be explained by the Indians' lack of immunity took hold because it served an ideological purpose. White physicians in South Africa, for instance, used virgin soil theory to explain the prevalence of tuberculosis among African mine workers. Randall Packard has argued that virgin soil theory appears to have been accepted more for its instrumentality than for its basis in historical fact. By blaming the disease on biological inadequacies of Africans, the theory provided defenders of the status quo in South Africa with a means of deflecting attention from the appalling conditions under which Africans lived and worked.
But while objections over slavery and genocide at least have some basis in reality, there's also anti-colonial propaganda that has zero truth to it whatsoever. In 2023, California removed a statue of the Catholic saint and Jesuit Junipero Serra. His supposed crimes include accusations of slavery, abuse of natives, and women. California made him the scapegoat of all the ills of colonization. But in reality, Saint Serra could rightfully be called the father of California. He gave up a comfortable life in Europe to come evangelize the Native Americans. He provided them many useful technologies that they still use today. Serra gave California its first real code of laws, and was a key figure in building the missions that would grow into California's most important cities.
Notice how PaxTube didn't actually refute these accusations, but instead pointed to the positive things Father Junipero Serra supposedly did. This tactic, shifting attention away from negative aspects by emphasizing the good, is a classic feature of colonialist rhetoric. Father Serra was responsible for several crimes against Native Americans. These include a form of cultural genocide by forcing indigenous people to embrace Catholicism, which generally involved the eradication of their traditional practices. The missions also engaged in forced labor to sustain themselves, and indigenous people were forbidden from leaving them. Additionally, there was a significant population decline during his mission, and physical punishments were practiced, which Serra himself justified. That spiritual fathers should punish their sons, the Indians, with blows appears to be as old as the conquest of, so general in fact that the saints do not seem to be any exception to the rule. Now, I won't deny that Serra had his positive aspects, such as advocating against the abuse of indigenous people by soldiers and even traveling to the capital of New Spain to demand better treatment. However, we cannot simply ignore or dismiss his negative actions. Just as he played a role in the foundation of California, he was also directly or indirectly responsible for the suffering of several Native people. Personally, my view on Father Serra lies somewhere in the middle. I see him as a man whose religious zeal drove him to his missionary work, which had both positive and deeply troubling consequences. However, we cannot allow one side of his legacy to overshadow the other simply because it aligns with our preferred narrative.
The native peoples of the New World truthfully had no better ally than the Church, and there are countless examples of clergy like Saint Serra standing up for their rights to the secular authorities. Condemnations like this are really just an anti-Catholic virtue signal. California, a product of colonization, will not be abolishing itself anytime soon. States like California want to erase their Catholic history, regardless of its positives, and replace it with secular liberalism.
As a side note, I love how these idiots think that secular liberalism is just LGBT marches and abortion when, in reality, it means separation of church and state and individual liberty.
We could go on about many of these so-called colonial atrocities. In recent years, Native groups in Canada claim to have detected so-called mass graves with ground-penetrating radar. The media ran with the claim and didn't question it. The implication was that Catholic residential schools performed mass executions of Native children and dumped their bodies. These bogus claims were repeated for months and led to terrorist attacks against dozens of Canadian Catholic churches. Finally, after proper research on the sites was done, no human remains were even found, let alone mass graves. The truth was obvious from the beginning, but it got scientific confirmation.
The Center for Truth and Reconciliation has already identified 4,000 child deaths related to these schools using school and state records. In many cases, these schools even had their own burial sites to cut costs. Now, while I acknowledge that there is no definitive proof regarding the extent of the issue, I find it wrong to reduce it to, there's no proof, therefore it didn't happen, as PaxTube tries to do. This is because these schools had a clear purpose of cultural genocide, something that cannot be denied. Again, even if there isn't concrete proof, we simply cannot minimize the negative impact these institutions had on indigenous communities. Oh, and by the way, there is no scientific confirmation disproving the existence of these burial sites. This is still an ongoing investigation, hindered by multiple factors.
And even if bodies are ever found, the far more likely explanation is that they're simply part of old graveyards. Imagine being a priest in the 1800s, dutifully burying your native friends just to be accused of killing them and dumping their bodies in mass graves 200 years later. This is the level of injustice and hysteria ginned up by anti-colonial propagandists. While any bad thing that happened during colonization is usually amplified by media and academia, what we should actually look at is all the positives. One of the most obvious positives of colonization was the positive mark the colonial pioneers left on history. Exploration of the globe has had benefits for mankind that are hard to calculate. The creation of sea trade routes across the world led to a major increase in the global standard of living. The early explorers and colonizers showed that the world can be changed through intelligence, determination, and downright zeal. They braved the seas, tamed the forests, and left us many countries that we now have the luxury of living in. Another obvious positive of colonization was the spread of technologies that significantly improved the lives of millions of people. I'll quickly name some of these technologies. Steel, horses, cattle, plows, seafaring ships, firearms, and crossbows. In some parts of the Americas, the colonists introduced monogamy. They also brought sugarcane, wheat, iron tools and kitchenware, clocks, print, carts, and carriages. I could go on. They even brought viticulture, that is, grape growing. Every vineyard in the Americas should have a statue of a missionary like Junipero Serra, who contributed their lives to bringing these advances here. The spread of European civilization and Christianity to the Americas also brought new, effective forms of government to the continent. It ended extremely brutal and endless warfare that had been going on between tribes for centuries, if not millennia. We know that colonial administration was effective because revolts against it were very rare. Professor Anthony McFarlane of the University of Warwick wrote, "Until the final half-century of Spanish rule, large-scale popular rebellion was all but unknown in Spanish America."
I left that whole section of PaxTub's video in place to set up a broader and recurring point in these kinds of videos: Eurocentrism. In case you haven't noticed yet, PaxTub is a Eurocentrist. It's easy to tell when you compare how he talks about Europeans, portraying them as universally benevolent and civilized, versus how he talks about other cultures, depicting them as savages in need of colonization to achieve stability. It's precisely this, Europeans never do anything wrong, mentality that leads people like PaxTub to defend colonization. How could Christian Europe possibly commit atrocities? Surely it's just black legend propaganda made up by enemies of the Holy Catholic Church. But reality is far more complex than what these clowns want to present. Europeans are not universally good, they never have been. No civilization has ever been universally good. All have committed their fair share of atrocities and made positive contributions. You can't have one without the other. And there's plenty of evidence to confirm that colonial empires committed numerous crimes during the colonization process. But when reactionaries like PaxTub are faced with this evidence, they don't have a better strategy than to deflect. Don't look at the bad stuff, just focus on the good. After all, it's more comfortable to talk about Columbus than about the atrocities he committed. The bad becomes irrelevant if there's a greater good, though. Who decides what that greater good is? PaxTub himself confirms this perspective.
What we should actually look at is all the positives.
But what's the problem with this? It leaves a crucial part of history untouched. And if we truly want to understand our present deeply, we simply cannot ignore the darker aspects of these processes. Doing so doesn't just result in narratives that portray colonization in a romanticized and idealistic way, it also allows for the historical claims of indigenous peoples to be forgotten. There is more than one perspective, Eurocentrists. Europe is not the protagonist of the world, it never was. Indigenous peoples who endured colonization have a point of view. Africans forcibly transported to the Americas have a point of view. Everyone who witnessed both the atrocities and the developments of colonization has a point of view. And if we want to truly understand history, view it more objectively, and approach the process of colonization more accurately, it is vital that these perspectives are also heard. We deserve less propaganda and more objective research. As for indigenous revolts, while it's true that it wasn't until the mid-1700s that these uprisings reached a large scale, to say that Spanish administration was effective simply because there weren't widespread revolts is a very bold claim, especially considering that in the end, it was these very revolts that brought the empire down. That's not even counting the fact that Spain still had to face smaller revolts and wars against native groups, like the Arauco War or the Mixton War, which mostly occurred in frontier areas and less explored regions. Quoting the very author PaxTube referenced. 4. While rare in Spain's colonial heartlands, war and rebellion persisted on frontiers where independent Amerindians resisted settler encroachment. Resistance was particularly robust among peoples who had not been previously conquered, were not accustomed to paying tributes to a ruling elite, and/or had a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle that made them less susceptible to attack and subjugation. Such peoples mounted powerful resistance in several regions, where new groupings emerged over the long term, in tribes formed by peoples who changed their social organization in response to the European invasions, chiefly by becoming more organized for war.
For these contributions alone to what we today call quality of life, New World colonists deserve honor. But celebrating them as mere technological innovators misses their motives. It leaves us with a reductive vision of the human person. European kingdoms sought glory, honor, and spreading the way of life that they truly believed was best for everyone. They dreamed of making a mark on history in a positive way. Catholic missionaries are accused by some of treating the natives as subhuman, but the opposite is true. As the journalist Christopher Check wrote, "Introducing civilization and its advantages was the means by which missionaries created the environment for their higher purpose, opening the gates of heaven to souls who had never heard the gospel and who had never been baptized." All in all, colonization had more positives than negatives. It brought valuable technology, new forms of government, and effective ways of life to the New World. New trade routes and infrastructure were developed that have only grown and become more active today. Colonization took Europe from a successful continent to a world-spanning continent. It wouldn't be until World War I when Europe lost this place of prominence in the world. Unfortunately, many governments in the world today disown their colonial past, but rather than condemning colonization, we should embrace its positive aspects. Courage, heroism, altruism, innovation. Colonization of the Americas demonstrated all of these traits. I hope this video has helped you see why.
To conclude this video, I want to leave you with a reflection. When I first watched this video, I let it slide, because at the time I was simply more ignorant about history. But as I grew more interested in the topic, and in opposing the reactionary discourse that PaxTube promotes, I could only think of two things. First, that this was one of the dumbest videos I had ever seen in my life, and second, that I had to refute it, out of respect for the discipline of history. Colonization was a complex process that we simply can't reduce to, the colonizers were genocidal maniacs, or, the colonizers were saints guided by God who never did anything wrong. The truth is far more complicated, but people like PaxTube take this topic and, driven by their victim complex of being under attack, spread their propaganda to keep pushing this narrative of tradition and the brave Catholic conquistador. But those of us who actually know history are fully aware that this is just garbage. And for the sake of history as a field, we must push back against it. Seriously, if we don't speak up and refute the propaganda of people like PaxTube, in 10 years we won't even be able to talk about the crimes of the colonizers. Or do you really think PaxTube believes in free speech? Now, some final thoughts, just to clarify my position on colonization. I'm a mestizo Latin American. I have indigenous, European, and maybe even some Asian blood in me. Still, even if a tarred Cath might not see it that way, I'm not asking the Catholic Church or Spain to apologize to me for anything. I'm not demanding that the Pope come to my country and apologize for crimes committed, nor that the King of Spain or any descendant of the conquistadors do the same. For the simple reason that I wasn't there, I didn't suffer the hardship, nor slavery, nor did I experience the so-called positive aspects of colonization. I'm not asking for an apology because I wasn't there, but that doesn't stop me from looking at the past and judging it, from reviewing what the colonizers did and calling it what it was, an atrocity. The past can and should be judged through the lens of the present. That doesn't mean I'm going around tearing down statues, but I'm also not going to defend every action of those who came to conquer these lands. In my view, the past is the past, and what happened, happened. I live in the 21st century, and I don't look at the past with scorn or pride, but as something that inspires me not to repeat the same mistakes. It inspires me to be better. We should strive to be better. PaxTard, the Tardcats and all those reactionary and conservative groups don't want to be better, because they know that being better requires something they refuse to embrace, self-criticism. That's why they have no choice but to defend colonization, even if it means justifying or outright denying the crimes committed during it. They refuse to let go of this narrative of the brave Catholic fighting for God and spreading the true faith, because letting go would mean letting go of their identity. And identity is a hell of a drug. But, thank God, I'm not a Tardcat. So I can afford to self-reflect, to look in the mirror and try to see my own flaws so I can correct them. If tomorrow I found out that one of my ancestors was a great conquistador or a diehard Catholic monarchist, I'd feel nothing but indifference. I'm not my ancestors, and I have no obligation to defend everything they believed or did. PaxTard and the Tardcats, meanwhile, will keep defending colonization as something universally and unquestionably good. As for me, I'll be right here, listening to and debunking their idealistic and romantic nonsense. Because I know history deserves better than PaxTard and his poorly sourced propaganda. That's how the battle to tell history unfolds, and if we don't contribute, then soon we won't even be able to talk about the massacre of Cholula. Anyway, that's my contribution to the subject of history today. I spent quite a bit of time reading articles and sources to provide the most accurate narrative and arguments possible. I may have made a mistake. If so, feel free to correct me in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.